That is planned, and the plan with that is that all state that we're going to track, it's either some really simple things that are just labels like the cluster name, and other things are going to be stored as files in a directory in the container. And we have tools to dump a bunch of those things. There's a command to export a lot of metadata, so we'll probably have that command also export the config. It exports some runtime info about Docker and all of the container logs and things. That is definitely something we want to do.
Okay. I think there's been a few people talking about, well, we opened an issue the other day about getting together some user stories and kind of understanding what everyone's use cases are. We've all come to this room because we all want to be able to test something, I guess. Is there anything, like any particular use case right now anyone's got to share that you might not already see the project kind of already trying to cover there, or are we all doing the same thing?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we're using KinD for, and I don't know if this counts as something we don't know about because I am a KinD contributor and I talk to Ben all the time, but we're using it specifically to test a application that runs on Kubernetes, and testing that in CI otherwise would involve having an existing container or spinning up like some container somehow on like GKE or something. But using KinD, we can spin up a container. We can spin up a cluster in a matter of minutes instead of tens or hundreds of minutes that some of the other tools will take. So I think that's a big win even outside of the core Kubernetes system, because a lot of people are developing apps for Kubernetes and they want to know that these apps actually run properly in a Kubernetes environment.
James is using this for Cert Manager, and that is like not the original use case, but it's definitely one that we are actively supporting. Again, I think these things need some work, things like UX, log output, that kind of thing. But supporting running other applications and testing them on it is a big thing. We've brought cluster boot time down to about like 40 seconds now, so it's a lot more tolerable for testing for us. Personally, not having to wait for like 10, 15 minutes of booting a GCE cluster is a huge win.
The other problem, so I also have CI tests that run on real clusters. And the other problem is, besides being slow, whenever you rely on like AWS to spin up EC2 instances for you, they just flake all the time.
Cops.
Yeah, we use KubeCoin, but it's like the same problem no matter what. That
the Kubernetes pre-submits have a big problem with that sort of thing.
Yeah. One other use case I think you touched on it already, but we have use cases where we need to test functionality across multiple clusters at the same time. So that's not a problem. You can sort of have multiple KinD clusters in the same Docker, right?
You can. That is supported today. Multi-node is not yet, but multi-cluster is. And Catherine has actually done a fun thing with that. You should attend her talk. She does some stuff with basically turning all of Kubernetes into unit tests and getting coverage information out of it. And to soak test that, she has a fun script that spins up something like 6 KinD clusters on her machine and runs the tests against all of them and combines the output. Got an adapter now, so if anyone's interested, I'm going to try to set up a demo. Happy to answer questions while I'm hacking on that.
Just out of interest as well, whilst Ben's doing multi-node, that use case, because for the likes of Cert Manager and things, we haven't really had such a need for multiple nodes. I wonder, it seems like obviously testing Kubernetes and testing Kubernetes itself, that's kind of, and testing Kubernetes itself could really do, well, obviously needs multi-node. I wonder though if like this is something that like the wider community like needs and wants. It's like absolutely something that's happening, without a doubt. I think it's already done, in fact, thanks to Fabrizio. But yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, does anyone else have, like, what are other people's needs for multi-node?
HA. Right. So actual HA control plane, because we want to eliminate, we want to first class HA in 114, which will mean multiple control plane nodes. So at least for KubeADM perspective.
I know Fabrizio has there's actually a PR out for most of this now. He has one where it runs a proxy container locally and actually runs a full HA cluster. He did a pretty awesome demo I wish I could replicate here, where he drained away access to some of the masters by just having exposed the proxy control plane and going to that UI and like disabling network to one of the masters. So I'm just going to create a default cluster here so we can see real quick, I guess. Oh, or maybe I'm not. Yes. I apparently already have it. So I'm going to clean up first. And you can see that's quick because it's just deleting a container.
So in terms of limitations, does that mean you can only run one at a time?
No, so it auto names everything so that, like, for example, the nodes have consistent node name, host name, container name. If you create a cluster again and don't specify a name, then you're going to have a name collision. We want to add a pre-flight check for that. We just haven't gotten to it yet. You can set a flag for a name. So we can go over to this other one. So we've got both of them booting now. It's a little bit slower on Mac, and it's probably a little bit slower on conference Wi-Fi. This is not doing the build. Build will add something like 4 to 5 more minutes, depending on your machine. And that's a bit unavoidable. We're using the most minimal Kubernetes build that we can that just captures the release outputs, but it's a big, slow build. So it creates a kubeconfig file for each cluster. Once you have that, you can just export the kubeconfig, and then we can do something like kubectl. Apologies, a little bit hard to type with a brace. And there you go. You have a cluster. Tearing it down is just delete cluster, and it's pretty quick. That's it. We can show building it if anyone's interested. It's not super exciting. You're basically watching Kubernetes build. If you use the Bazel mode, yes. It's invoking Kubernetes build systems. It doesn't have its own. It's wrapping those and collecting the outputs, basically. No. It's running on your host, but confusingly, Kubernetes has a build system that runs inside Docker. And that one's slightly incremental. The Bazel one is much more incremental. No, unfortunately, we don't even use a Docker file for the node image. We're doing some interesting, fun things, so we're actually using Docker commit. Sorry.
So you pointed at sort of arbitrary Kubernetes commits.
Right.
Do you know how far back?
111. Because of KubeADM, we're using KubeADM config, and we haven't tried to port that to 110. Which is quite a bit different.
What's another, use case I have is testing against creating multiple clusters?
That's something we're probably not going to be as good about unless we get more support from community users, particularly from a SIG testing side. The Kubernetes project officially supports 3 releases, and that's a decent bit to support.
Well, I mean, we'll support old clusters in 20, 45 years. LLMs will be old. It'll be great.
More seriously, I'm actually really hoping Kubernetes is now GA. We have a beta config. We've switched to that now for new enough Kubernetes. Ideally, we get to the completely stable config, and then we can remove a lot of logic that needs to like select over different config versions and things. There's small differences between them.
One thing to get around the Docker commit magic might be to look at. There's a library that we publish, Google/Go container registry, to help you build kind of images programmatically, so you can do things like append some binaries.
The way we're doing it right now, we're actually, for the Bazel one and for the one I didn't mention, it can install from the released apt packages. When we do that, we're actually running some installation. So that doesn't work as well with that. We might switch the binaries, in which case we will switch to a more normal build. There's some upsides and downsides to both. We get a little bit more coverage for testing, a little bit more complexity in kind, but it was a pretty small trade-off. All of the code that for doing that is shared with the code used for like manipulating the normal containers. And it's fairly hermetic. We stage everything into a temp directory that it exists for the duration of the build. So we don't have any major issues there. Normally people are worried about Docker commit mostly because it's not very reproducible. This is about as reproducible as you're going to get with a Kubernetes build at the moment. So, fun thing, we do this. You should come to our talk. So, we have a talk about Kubernetes' own CI is Kubernetes. And we have CI results running the conformance suite against master. And you can actually see that some of these things that depend on like events actually flake every so often when they're not on a GCE cluster. But this is running KinD in a pod. So we have Kubernetes on Kubernetes. Why not? Right. That was the main goal. Nested virtualization was not really something we wanted to use or barely had access to, but nesting containers is fairly doable. It does get a little ridiculous when you have Docker and Docker and Docker and Docker, but it mostly works okay. Kubelet gets a little angry about all of these containers and C groups it doesn't understand. We've found a few Kubernetes bugs this way. I found a kubelet panic. There was a previous iteration that a colleague did who's working somewhere else now, and it actually, that's how it always shipped. It ran a cluster inside a container. So you had 2 layers of Docker and Docker always. We removed that because it turned out to not really be very helpful, and it's a lot more annoying to work with locally. With this one, you can kind of just Docker exec into each node, and from that point, you have a bash shell, and it's what you'd expect.
You talked about like the first time you created a cluster, you didn't have to build Kubernetes, and then you could use
Yeah, so the default, there's that. There's also the default command line, no flags. We ship stable images on Docker Hub, and we have pinned to an exact image with the release, and it will boot that image.
if I'm not a Kubernetes developer and I just want to use KinD to start a cluster and configure with Kubernetes.
Right, you just run KinD create cluster. I think right now it's a 112.2 cluster.
Yeah, I guess I'm just like thinking back to what Tom said, like the user experience of like that versus Minikube. Like, how do we sort of pitch these things to the sort of user community as like getting started experiences? Do we think KinD?
Minikube is a significantly more more stable, more mature tool. I see it as a very polished experience for like, I want stable released Kubernetes and I want to be able to do everything. I can run a local load balancer, ingress, or do like GPU plugin, or something that we haven't figured out how to ship yet is multiple container runtimes and selecting over those. You have all of those things already with Minikube and they work great.
So it kind of more positioned for as a developer tool as opposed to
For the moment, yeah. If people are interested and want to work on this, I think we could probably turn it into a good end user tool, but it is definitely not the focus right now because Minikube is already great at this, and we need it in CI.
yeah, I'm trying to figure out like as like we're looking at the SIG, trying to figure out like where the different pieces fit and how they go together. You know, over time we're gonna want to start collapsing things that are like 90% overlapping, right? And you know, not next week, but you know, hopefully a year from now when we come as a SIG, we have slightly fewer tools that get stuff. I'm trying to figure out where things fit. But the answer is CI and maybe developers for now. We'll figure it out later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible, but like, I haven't really wanted to like delve into anyone else's space there, and like, there's a lot to do for CI at the moment. I want it to have a reasonably polished user experience because the other goal is that when you run a pre-submit, someone should be able to look at that, grab one line, and run it on their machine, and not worry about it. Right now, they can't do that because they need cloud resources or. Right, like here, pay Google a bunch of money and run a cube up on your machine and wait like 15 minutes for that, and that's a bad experience. It has a default storage class with host path. We have some people looking at other more advanced things, but nothing yet. I'm not sure how active they are on that either. I'm not targeting it right now because I'm kind of terrified of someone using this for a stateful workload. That sounds like a really bad idea. Right. So we have someone from Helm, I believe, actually, who was looking into this for that reason. We should probably sync up with them. They talked to some other people that were working on local storage solutions. Once we can find one of those suitable, we'll definitely ship it.
Back to something Tim mentioned earlier, talked about trying to use KinD as the only PR gating check. Which types of current PR gating tests can not run?
So I'm not exactly sure what all tests these are right now, but there are a bunch of tests that do things like use NSEnter and then run sudo on the host. And those are huge red flags for something like KinD. There are also a lot of tests that we run for things like storage. And so far, my understanding from the storage SIG is they don't feel confident yet using like mock and local drivers to cover all of the important code paths. So that might be a little risky, but that should be improving going forward. And we should be moving towards CSI anyhow. We should be able to just test the CSI paths. However, from talking to them, there are some things that just like don't make as much sense with local drivers, so they don't have good coverage there. So things that actually use GCE intentionally, which is, I guess, a separate debate. And then things that are trying to do a lot of privileged mucking with the host are probably a bad idea. Those tests might not be the best targets for pre-submits to begin with, though.
And you said multi-node is not as far as it like.
It's not. However, someone finally dropped their PR for that this morning. I've only had time to glance over it, but we've been discussing this for a while. I have an alternate prototype as well.
So do you think we could do things like run auto scalar tests on this instead of on top of this?
I believe so, once we have that ready. I also know Federation is using it. I think the other thing is we have some tests right now that are targeting scalability and GPU plugin in pre-submit. Again, GPU plugin might be a good target to be a post-submit. It's been pretty stable anyhow. But that gets into telling people, like, I'm going to move your signal around and stuff. So we'll need to have some discussion with them on that. We're also, in SIG testing, we are also looking at how we can improve the experience around post-submits. I think something that I'm hoping to push independently of this going forward is to have SIGs have a dashboard for their tests with subscribe alias. SIG cluster lifecycle has this today. Most SIGs don't have an alias for this, so if we move their tests into post-submit, no one is maintaining that, and then it's all on the release team again. We need to avoid that, but that's something that we kind of need to fix anyhow. For a bit of context, usually I work on test info things and SIG testing and release.
How are you going to manage releases?
For KinD? So I'm got one out now. Semver, ideally, will hopefully actually keep with that. We are using it, but we only have one release. We're putting binaries on GitHub for the command line, and we have images on Docker Hub. When we specify an image as a default, we pin to the image hash so that it won't change out from underneath you. So ideally, CI will use one of those pinned binaries, and then for the base image, it will use the pinned base image. And if the CI is not building Kubernetes, it will use the pinned node image.
You said you run the sort of minimal set of things you use in Kubernetes cluster. How is that defined?
So building, I get to build a little bit less things than what we're usually building. We build things like release tarballs and test tarballs and like hypercube image or just things you don't actually need.
Like, how do you decide, like, here's how I run my API server, here's the flags I have?
Kubatum. It's just like almost near default Kubatum. We're specifying a few things that we need, like telling it where the API server endpoint is, right? But we're not trying to customize things like how we run the API server. We want to be testing the standard code path.
And so then you don't apply like, any add-ons or any of that junk like the cluster directory?
Not currently, no.
You won't pursue it.
Right, and things like the dashboard tests we're kind of moving away from anyhow, so we're just not bothering with that.
Have you thought about exposing it as a library or an API, especially if it's going to be used for CI and testing?
It nominally does this, though I found for something like the Kubernetes CI, it's going to be a lot more straightforward to publish a stable binary, and then whenever we find that there's some breakage in Kubernetes master, that we can just switch out the binary underneath rather than running a vendor update and potentially updating a bunch of other libraries incidentally that KinD updated. I think it will be much easier if we keep that decoupled. However, it is written such that there's not a lot of logic in the binaries, and most of it is in some library packages, and there are people looking at this. It's not quite as stable, so it would need to be vendored. My biggest concern there is that we find something that's broken, and then we need to update it, and then now you're dragging in a bunch of other updates you weren't expecting. With the command line, I know exactly what the exposed surface is that you're using, and I can not break that.
Is there a config file for kind of thing?
There is. It doesn't do much currently, but there's a pretty large PR out to change it to specify a list of nodes in their configurations.
And how does that take that Kubernetes config and
So
incorporate it, or?
KinD generates a Kubernetes config. Currently, we expose, you can specify patches you'd like to apply to it, and internally we use customize to apply the patches. No one's actually using this currently. They were previously. Cert Manager needed to do some fun networking stuff.
You said that you don't add any add-ons, but you also mentioned
We need a CNI. Even if we're not really using the CNI, Kubelet is pretty unhappy when you don't have a CNI. I don't see why not. It's a cluster. You can apply configs to it. I mean, so versus like say a real cluster, your storage story is different, and you don't have a cloud provider. You're using one kernel, So occasionally some more advanced things may run into issues with that. Things like networking are pretty well namespaced, but like I mentioned, for example, if you have something that wants to set time, that's not sandboxed.
Have you thought about mounting the host folders? Like if I want to like develop on my source code and Docker volume them?
There's a open request for this. We've just held off on adding that until we have the better config to add that to. Because again, we don't want to have a super large surface with the flags, because the other thing is, we're trying to keep most things in config where we have versioning, we use the Kubernetes API machinery, and we can attempt to avoid breaking you when we make changes to how config works. There are only a few flags right now. There's one for specifying the config, there's one for specifying the image, and there's one for specifying the cluster name. There's two advanced ones for retaining the nodes if for some reason cluster up doesn't work and you want to debug them afterwards. Default is it will clean up. And there's one for setting how long you want it to wait for the nodes to be ready, which is sometimes useful in CI. Whereas locally, you could probably go about what you were doing and come back to using the cluster. No idea.
How many layers of Kubernetes on Kubernetes have you tried before it like just freezes everything with the
I haven't actually tried more than Kubernetes on Kubernetes yet. There's some there's some annoying things with Docker and Docker in general that you have to avoid. You could do it. It's not a good idea. It should work, but don't. We do also, when we're running it in CI, we run a host machine with Docker on it, which we run a pod in, which we run Docker in, which we run KinD in, which runs a container, which runs Docker, which runs containers. It works great. Yeah, it actually seems to perform well. We can run the conformance tests faster than we can on GC just because we avoid so much time booting and deleting the cluster. And slightly faster build. With our GCE tests, we spend around 20 minutes in a typical job on pushing the build, upping the cluster, downing the cluster. With KinD, we spend under a minute creating the cluster, and we spend a couple of seconds deleting it.
What takes all the time after starting the cluster to do things? Just starting the container, right?
KinD, waiting for Docker to be ready, and then Kubernetes going through its steps takes a little bit. Setting up all the manifests, starting containers, waiting for containers to be ready before Kubernetes internally runs some things as add-ons. So it's waiting for things to be ready before doing that, and then we have to apply the CNI. The slowest parts are the steps where Kubernetes needs to wait on something and where we need to wait on Docker. So actually something that we'll be looking at there at other container runtimes, because that is actually a decent part of the boot. On the other hand, Docker is pretty widely known. So even with Docker and Docker, I think it's easier for people to work with and debug. So I think it will probably stay the default for now.
Is there a way to run split versions between control plane and node versions, or is it not very common?
When we add the multi-node PRs and actually merge them, there are ways to split versions, and that's something we want to target in testing. Upgrades are not currently. However, I don't think there's any reason we couldn't implement upgrades.
Yeah, split versions is great. We have a lot of our upgrade tests right now are really just testing version speed, and if we just test version speed, that would be a much better way to do it.
In my master plan is testing three-way version skew and having just like an assortment of nodes at different versions and seeing what happens. ostensibly we support plus or minus one version for most things, but we don't really test this anywhere. We test plus and we test minus.
Where can people get involved?
So sigs.kates.io/kind. We've got an issue tracker up. James and I are going to be spending some more time on that this week, especially considering all the influx. We've got some milestones up and some issues that exist. I think a few of them are marked help wanted and will be moving more. There's also a docs/todo.md that kind of has a wish list. We're going to migrate to moving all of that into issues, but if you want to peek at things that aren't in issues yet, the to-do file has a kind of laundry list of things that we probably ought to do.
And you said you had cut a release, so you can download something and put it in.
There is a release. You can grab that from the releases page for Mac or Linux. I might put up Windows binaries later after I get a chance to make sure that works. I haven't recently. You can also go get sigs.kates.io/kind if you have a recent-ish Go, and that should work fine. There is a Slack channel. It's kind on the Kubernetes Slack. There is no mailing list or regular meeting yet. We've been operating under SIG testing. However, I think we'll probably want to add a meeting soon. And if we do, I will put a note about it in the README and in the Slack channel.
There's a lot of overlap with C++ lifecycle. Do we think that we would ever adopt you as a sub-project to divorce you from C testing? Or do you think it's really-
So I think I'm relatively fine with that ish. I think the main thing is that I operate the most under SIG testing, and that was also somewhat of a nice way to avoid politics. For a long time, KinD was quietly built in test infra while we sorted things out, made sure things work. Around this week was when we were planning to start asking people to take a look at it. Pretty much. Tim also dropped a tweet on Twitter that kind of spiked a lot of traffic to the repo. Yeah, I imagine there's going to be a lot of overlap. I'm happy to try to work with people on that. I also was hoping to avoid it as much as possible. There's a lot of niches for this kind of tool. I just saw one today that uses copy on write VMs and is implemented as a Go library you import into your unit tests. And they're using it for every unit test for Metal LB, which is a bare metal load balancer. There's another very interesting one outside of the project if you run systemd-based systems that uses systemd inspawn by KinVolk, I believe, called, I think it's like KubeSpawn. That one actually looks quite good. We just can't tell everyone they have to run systemd.